So, Merry Christmas. Thank you for saying that. Confession right out of the gates. I apparently, according to Brian last week, am a rule breaker. My house has been decorated since the beginning of November. Music has been playing in my house since the beginning of November. I don't play by the rules, apparently. And I just want to get that out there and let you know. Merry Christmas. Welcome to the second Sunday of our series called The Baby Story. We've been talking about this story that is so much a part of our season, but is not intended to be just a part of our season. It's actually intended to, if we will allow it, it's intended to transform our entire lives. And so it is my privilege to be able to talk about that second week this week. And in saying that, today is the second week of Advent. And today our word, last week we thought about the word of hope. And today our word is joy. Now, some of you have been around church for a while. You're like, no, Lee, you've got it wrong. You're out of order. I already told you I was a rule breaker, and maybe that has nothing to do with it. We're talking about joy this week. One, there's no real prescribed order, but we have an order that's leading us to an event on Christmas Eve. And so we're going to come back and talk about joy on Christmas Eve. So we moved joy up in the order so that we could talk about it early and be thinking about it early. So today we're going to talk about joy. Now, having said that, I hope you're planning to be a part of what we're going to do together on Christmas Eve, because we're going to celebrate joy in big ways. And it's a good thing for us to do that. As followers of Jesus, the story is so important that we should be celebrating that. That's something that we should come together. We've agreed upon a day that we're going to remember God's great love demonstrated through his gift of a baby in a manger and the unbelievable and unexpected plan that was Jesus. And so we should come together. But in addition to that, Christmas is a time when others who are not yet followers of Jesus are more likely to consider the story. At least they'll put themselves in a place where they get to hear this transformational story. And so one of the things that we love about Christmas Eve is, unlike any other week of the year, any other time of the year, to be honest, people are interested in joining us. And I hope now you're already beginning to pray about who you might bring with you, because we're called as followers of Jesus to live on mission. And that means that we don't just have joy in us, but we have joy coming out of us. And our joy is contagious, and it is something that we share. And so we lean into that idea. And so Christmas Eve at 4 and 6 in particular, we're going to put a big celebration together, and this room will be full. And so plan accordingly, but I hope it'll be full with your friends, your colleagues, your coworkers, your neighbors, your classmates, all of those people that God has put into your circle of influence so that they can hear the same story that you've heard and that has transformed your life. And then at 11, for those that are a little more traditional, our candlelight service happens. And so I hope you're already praying about that. In fact, I hope that you are constantly praying about how God can use you where he has placed you. We think that's an important part of our following of Jesus, and it continues the Christmas story beyond these December days, but it continues it throughout the year if we live intentionally engaging the world around us so that they see the love and joy of Jesus in us and have an opportunity to engage with it. You might find that a bit challenging, and we would love to coach you in how to do that. And so we have opportunities where we talk about various ways that you can step into being a missional person. One of those is a very practical way next Sunday, immediately following the second service. For those of you that are willing to stay around, we'd like to walk across the parking lot and invite our neighbors to be a part of our Christmas Eve service and give them a gift and just let them know how much we appreciate them and how much we would love for them to join with us. That's a very simple and easy way for you to get started. Maybe you want a little more help in that, and in January we offer an experience called Living on Mission. You can go ahead and sign up for that if you want to. But whatever the case may be, I hope that the joy that is transforming your life doesn't just live inside you, but it comes outside of you. Now that some of you are saying, hey, you just preached your message, can we get on with it? Yeah, well, we could sing and walk out, but that's no fun for me. And so I'm gonna do a little more than that, and I hope you'll be a part of that, because I've been thinking about this word joy. And this idea of joy, we've got this Christmas decoration that I told you went up at my house way before the rules allowed for it. And it's this Christmas decoration that's two-sided. On one side it says joy, on the other side it says Merry Christmas. And I thought about that. It's interesting we chose joy because I think joy is one of those words that's just kind of synonymous with Christmas. Like I've never seen any research, but I'll bet you that if we clocked how many times joy was said as opposed to some other words during the Christmas season, joy would be the most used word, the most sung word, the most written word, the most shared word about Christmas, save Merry and Christmas. I just think we use it a lot. We talk about it a lot. Lexus is telling us that we can find joy in a new car if you've been watching any of those commercials. Zillow and Realtor.com tell us we can find joy in a new house. And some of you are negotiating with yourself right now and saying, I could find joy if I just had a new job, right? But we know that's really not joy. And in a season when we talk about joy, I think it's ironic because as I look around, I don't think we're a very joy-filled people. In fact, I think we are far more Grinch than we are Kris Kringle. I think that's probably like more of us are on the green side. Like you were out shopping yesterday and you were green, and you're thinking about shopping later and you're the green. Like the jolly guy doesn't live anywhere in you right now, does it? And yet this season is called joy. And maybe that's because we've kind of confused what joy is. Maybe it's because we've bought into what Lexus and Toyota are telling us that a new car would bring joy. Or maybe it's because we bought into the idea that a new house would bring joy. But we know that's not the same thing, don't we? I mean, how many parents are there in the room? Okay, I'll just take you back for a minute, those of you who are maybe a little like me. You remember when this happened to you? Now there was a moment of joy, wasn't it? I just can't equate a new car with the moment I heard my daughter's heartbeat and saw this. But now some of you, I know you're of the 3D generation, and you've got a picture of your kid before they're born, and you know the color of their hair and the color of their eyes. You know their email address, their cell phone numbers, their social media. You know all that stuff. You didn't get to live with the squiggly lines, because if we're honest, most of us who got this picture, by the time we got it home, we're like, where's the baby? Right? We just know it as a bunch of squiggly lines. You know, the interesting thing about that picture and that sound is this. As I stood there that day and I heard the heartbeat of my girls both times, I was overwhelmed by that sense of joy. And yet, at the same time, I had no idea what was coming. Right? Every parent in the room is agreeing with me. You heard that. No idea what was coming. It was a picture that was so exciting. It was a sound that was so exciting. And my heart raced as I heard it. But the truth of the matter is, there was pain, and there were tears, and there was conflict, and there were difficult decisions. There were sleepless nights. There were dirty diapers. There were stomach viruses. And here's what I want to tell you as a parent of an adult. I've got 2 adult children who have left home, and they're out on their own adventure. My joy for them when I hear their voice and I see them today is no less than it was when I heard that heartbeat. But the story is very different than what I thought when I stood there. Very, very different. And today we're gonna talk about that part of God's story. If you've got your Bibles, we're gonna go on a little adventure for a few minutes. I'm gonna invite you to turn to Genesis chapter 25. While you're turning there, let me just tell you where we're headed. See, the cool thing about that picture is it's a little bit like the story of Abram. And it's this story that here's the picture and it sounds really good, it looks really good, but it's just not fully developed. Have no idea what's coming. Last week we started with the foreshadowing of Jesus in the early part of Genesis in God's communication with Adam and Eve. We're going to fast forward several thousand years to the man Abram, and we're going to pick up with the story of Abraham. In order to know the story of Abram and appreciate the nature of this story, it's going to be important for you to hear a lot of the story. Abram lived to be 175 years old, as you're going to see in just a minute. And we need to cover a lot of those years. And so what we're going to do over the next few minutes is we're going to go on a journey with Abram, and I'm going to walk you through a significant part of Genesis. But I want to start at the end. If you've got your Bibles or your devices open, Genesis 25 is where we are. And we're going to start on Abraham's journey that is based on his trust in the promise of God. And before I even jump into his story, here's what I want to tell you is there's a takeaway already in this simple directive statement about where we're going in our outline. It's this, that the trust that we have in God will lead us on a journey of faith that is filled with joy. Genesis chapter 25 is the end of Abram's story. He would become known, and you see in a minute, as Abraham. And Genesis chapter 25 tells us this. It's kind of the last moments, it is literally the last moments of his life. These are the years of Abraham's life that he lived, 175 years. Abraham breathed his last and died in a ripe old age, an old man, and satisfied with life. And he was gathered to his people. That's the end of the story. The end of the story says, here is Abraham who has lived this long, rich life, 175 years. And the epitaph of his life is, he lived a life that was satisfying. The Hebrew word there that is translated satisfying, in some of your translations it might say full of years. The Hebrew word actually translates literally a life that was abundant and abounding. That should ring a bell, and I'll come back and ring that bell harder in just a minute. But I want to take you through his life. So flip over now a few pages to Genesis chapter 12, where we first see Abram. And what I'm going to do, I'm just going to tell you up front while you're turning there, I'm going to walk through about 25 years of his life, about 13 chapters or so of scripture. And what I'm going to do is just tell you what's going on in each chapter. I'll read a couple of verses that are important to what we're talking about, and then I'm going to say turn the page, which means I'm going to the next chapter, okay? But I want to give you the whole narrative of Abram's life. And it starts like this. In Genesis chapter 12, I'm going to start by reading these first few verses because they are important verses. The Lord said to Abram, leave your native country, your relatives, and your father's family, and go to the land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you and make you famous, and you will be a blessing to others. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who treat you with contempt. All the families on the earth will be blessed through you. We know this as the Abrahamic covenant. God comes to 75-year-old Abraham, or Abram at this time, and he says, Abram, I want you to follow me. And he asked him to leave the place where he is. He asked him to leave actually three things. He asked him to leave his country, he asked him to leave his family, and he asked him to leave his inheritance. And all of the things that go with that make up great messages that we're not going to preach this morning. But God says, Abram, I'm asking you to follow me. We had seen the journey of his family that led to where he was. You can go back and read in the previous chapters and find out how Abram got where he was. But in this moment, God says, leave this place that does belong to you. Leave these people that are a part of who you are, that are so much a fabric of your being, and go to a place that you don't know. I'm going to lead you, and I'm going to do this. I'm going to give you descendants, I'm going to give you a blessing, and I'm going to make you a blessing, and I'm going to give you land. Now, there's parts of that are puzzling, right? I already have land. Why do I need land? And God says, I've got a better place. And there's some dilemma in that. We'll come back and we'll visit that in a moment. But here's what I want you to pay attention to, because it becomes a thread that's an important part of Abraham's life. The next verse, I'm not going to put it on the screen. Just listen as I read it. So Abram departed as the Lord had instructed. See, Abram obeyed. When God came and he said, here, I'm going to make a promise. I'm going to make a covenant. A covenant is just an agreement between two parties that have mutual responsibility, or both have responsibilities to the covenant. Part of Abram's responsibility was to follow, to be obedient, to leave. So if Abram left, that was his way of saying, I'm going to sign the covenant. Me leaving is agreeing to the covenant. So Abram leaves. And he leaves this land. He takes with him his wife, Sarai, his nephew, Lot, and his farm. All of his livestock and all of his hired men, all of his servants, they all start to move. He has no idea where he's moving. He just knows he's following God. And he trusts God. And because he trusts God, he obeys God. And so he takes off and he leaves for that land. And what happens is, as he leaves, God leads him along every step of the way. Abram and his tribe following him are living in tents, a nomadic lifestyle. And as he's following God, they begin to enter Canaan, which is what the land that God promised was called. And as he enters Canaan, something happens. A famine strikes. And now it feels like the covenant is in danger, Because now Abram and Lot and all of their tribe have to run to Egypt, and there in Egypt they find safety and provision in the midst of the famine, and it seems like I've left the land to have nothing. I'm now just a pauper in Egypt. Now, Abram never complains. Abram doesn't stop following. He continues to trust God to be faithful to his promises because he knows that God is a covenant-keeping God. He knows that God is worthy of his trust and God will keep his promises. Famine ends and they return to the land. And as they return to the land, what happens? And I didn't mean to do that. As he returns to the land, what happens is then a war breaks out. Before the war breaks out, though, a tension arises between Lot's farm and Abram's farm. And Abram is a man of peace and a man of blessing. You'll see throughout the course of his life, I won't have time to go into detail about it, but you'll see throughout the course of Abram's life that he was a blessing to those around him wherever he was. He was a man who not only followed God, but lived on mission. And so Abram is a blessing wherever he goes, and as he goes back into the land, there's a tension between he and Lot, and in order to keep peace, he says to Lot, turn the page, chapter 13, he says, you go right, I'll go left. If you want to go left, I'll go right. You pick. But let's separate so that we stay at peace, so that I can bless you and we can be blessed together and we stay at peace. And so Lot chooses and they separate. And then as they separate, if you turn the page, what happens is a war breaks out, chapter 14. Rival kings want to come and take over this land that God has promised to Abram, and they begin to move on certain parts, particularly the parts where Lot has decided to dwell. And as they move on that, they take Lot captive, and Abram, again, being a blessing to the people around him, he rallies about 300 or so of his men, forms a little small battalion of an army, and they go and they rescue Lot and broker peace among the warring nations. And everybody is once again in harmony, or some type of harmony. And Abram is a blessing to those around him. As they do that, then Abram, turn the page, Abram comes back and he begins to think, because he has been traveling nomadically through the land, he begins to think that God is indeed fulfilling his promise and he's giving him the land, but that God has also promised him descendants, and he begins to think, how am I going to have descendants? Because see, here's the problem. Sarai was infertile. So he began to look at his farm and he saw these servants that he had. And he had one servant that had a child, and that servant was actually an heir. He was the only heir to Abram's inheritance. And he says to God in chapter 15, God, see, here it's worked out. Because Abram knows that God somehow, some way is going to keep his promise. Even though he was looking at squiggly lines on that ultrasound, that sonogram that he got, he didn't understand it. He knew somehow, some way, God would keep his promise. So maybe God's intention was to keep his promise through the servant child. And God says, no, that's not right. Chapter 15, God says, no, I've made a promise to you, and my promise is that your descendants, in fact, he walks Abram outside in the night sky. He says, look up, count the stars. And Abram says, I can't count the stars. And God says, right, that's how numerous your descendants will be. I promise you descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky. And once again, God doubles down on his covenant. Abram, I've promised you land, I've promised you descendants, and I've promised you blessing, both on you and through you. And Abram says, okay. And God says, this time, Abram, just to reaffirm our covenant, I want you to make a sacrifice to me. And so Abram makes a sacrifice. This is the second way that Abram has weighed in on the covenant, because he weighs in and says yes, because God's been faithful up to this point as far as Abram understands. It doesn't look like what he thought when God first said it. It doesn't look like what God thought as he's saying it a second time, but he trusts God. He trusts that God's ways are on target, and he trusts that God is leading to something. And so he says yes, and they seal that covenant. So turn the page, chapter 13, because at the end of chapter 15, there is more. That becomes a theme in Abram's life. There is more. Chapter 16, God says to Abram, through your bloodline, and so Sarai and Abram look at each other and say, well, God keeps his promise, and through the bloodline, he's going to bring descendants. And Sarai says to Abram, look, I can't have children. At this point in time in my life, it's clear I can't have children. So take my Egyptian servant girl, Hagar, have a child with her, and then that way, through the bloodline, you have a descendant. So Abram agrees. The child is born. She names him Ishmael. As the child is born, Sarai and Abram are convinced that this was unusual, but yet how God was going to meet the covenant promise. And so they're at peace with that. Look, God has done this. Here's the descendant that God has brought, a bloodline descendant. And the problem is Hagar begins to realize that she has a bit of control because she's the mother of the heir. And tension arises between Sarai and Hagar runs because Sarai makes it quite uncomfortable for her, and Hagar is in the wilderness, and God says, no. Your son is not the one I promised Abram, but I will take care of him, and I will provide for him. Go back and submit to the authority of Sarah and Abram. So she does. There's the whole Sodom and Gomorrah thing that happens. We don't have time to go into that, but turn the page, chapter 17, because there is more. Chapter 17, God comes to Abram one more time. Not one more time, again. And he says to Abram, your name, Abram, means exalted father. I'm going to change it. I'm going to change it to Abraham, which means father of multitudes, because Abraham, through you, I will bring nations. Not just a few descendants, not just a bunch of grandkids. I will bring nations. Your descendants, as I have already promised, will be as numerous as the stars in the sky, be as numerous as the grains of sand along the ocean shore. Unable to count them, Abraham. And Abraham says, great, but Ishmael, he's the plan. And he goes, no, Ishmael's not the plan. I promised you and Sarai, and God changes Sarai's name to Sarah. I promised you and Sarah a son. I will give you a son a year from today. Inside, Abraham goes, I'm 99 years old. I often think about that exchange when he went home and said to Sarah, hey, in a year, you're going to have a baby. Sarah's at that point in time, 89 years old. There's all kinds of things I'd love to say. I don't have time. It's just a funny exchange. Because both Sarah and Abraham laugh when they're told. But God, there's always more, and God has a plan. And Sarah at this point now gets pregnant. Turn the page. As God has now in chapter 17 doubled down one more time on his covenant. Abraham, I promise you land, descendants, blessing on you, and blessing through you. And this time he says, here's what I want you to do. First, your sign of covenant agreement is to leave. Second, your sign of covenant agreement is to make a sacrifice. Third, your sign of covenant agreement is to carry this in your physical body through circumcision. Every male will be circumcised going forward of your descendants, Abraham. And by the way, I want you to catch up. I want all the males that are part of your family to be circumcised. I want you to be circumcised as a demonstration that you agree to the covenant. At 99, Abraham is circumcised, and all of his male servants are circumcised, and his 13-year-old son, Ishmael, is circumcised. But with God, as I said, there is always more. Turn the page, and at 100 years old in chapter 18, Isaac is born. Sarah has a baby. And God has fulfilled that promise to give Abraham a bloodline descendant. But the phrase that I've been saying regularly through this narrative is still true, because in chapter 18, there is still more. Because that's a true principle with God. Now, I love this story, and we're going to skip for a while now the rest of Abraham's life that leads all the way up to 175. But I want to say this, that several thousand years after Abraham would die, God would ultimately fulfill his promise to make Abraham a blessing to the nations through the birth of Jesus. Because Abraham's story continues beyond his life. And if you fast forward to the Christmas story that we know, Matthew chapter 1, verse 1, the beginning of the Christmas story in Matthew's record starts like this. This is the record of the ancestors of Jesus, a descendant of David, and look at that phrase, and of Abraham. God would bring a new covenant that would bless all the families of the earth, that would bless you and me. We sit here today under the blessing that began way back here with Abraham. That little ultrasound, if Adam and Eve got the pregnancy stick, you know, the little stick that had the sign on it, if they got the pregnancy stick that said a baby's coming, Abraham got the ultrasound and the heartbeat. And Abraham and Sarah held that ultrasound, so to speak, and they looked at that and they had no idea what was coming. They had no idea what the adventure would be, what the journey would look like, but they did know this, that God is a covenant-keeping God. You see, there's some dilemma in Abraham's story, or for Abraham in the story. And in that dilemma, Abraham knows a few things. The dilemma is in what he knows and what he doesn't know, that conflict between them. See, there's 3 promises that God makes to Abraham. I promise you land, I promise you descendants, and I promise you blessing. And when Abraham sees that, when Abraham hears that at 75, God promised him land, but he's going to leave the land he already has to go to a land that is plagued with famine and war. And Abraham will spend his life looking for a permanent residence. Abraham will never build a house. He'll never have a grand estate. His whole thing is not the big ranch house where all the grandkids come in and sit around the fireplace. That's not Abraham's life. That's not his story. And yet he ends his life abounding and abundant, a satisfied life full of years. God promises him land. In fact, as he enters Canaan, and we could spend a whole lot of time talking about this, but we won't. He just says, Abraham, I'm going to march you through various places, and everything from here to there to there to here, all of this is yours. And Abraham lives in that land as a nomad, as a migrant, in a tent for his entire life. And so there's a dilemma in that for Abraham. It's a constant, God, how does this play itself out? How does it play itself out? I'm going to be faithful because you are faithful. And so I'm going to keep following because you are trustworthy and worthy of my following. But I don't know how it plays itself out. And with every step of obedience, the picture gets clearer and clearer for Abraham. The second dilemma that he faces is that God promises descendants. He doesn't promise just a descendant. He promises a multitude of descendants. And Sarah is infertile. God, how in the world are you going to do this? This woman can't have children, and yet you're telling me we're going to populate the earth. Nations will come for me. And so every step of the way, there was always that question, God, how are you going to do it? How are you going to do it? But there was never a doubt that God was going to do it. I don't understand how, God, but I know you will. And I'm going to be obedient, and I'm going to continue to obey. I'm going to continue to be faithful. And then there was the promise of blessing. And in Abraham's culture, blessing was a sense of permanence, a sense of belonging, a sense of inheritance. He had an inheritance that he left. But the writer of the New Testament would remind us that Abraham was constantly looking for the eternal inheritance that ultimately he would find. You see, here's what I want you to see about Abraham, and I've worked all the way through this story because I want to make sure that you understand some principles that God has for us in this story. Abraham doesn't know how God will work. In the midst of the uncertainty and the unknowing, Abraham decides and determines to be faithful in following God even when he doesn't understand. Isn't that a challenge for us? I mean, you may find yourself in a place right now where God has asked you to follow him in some way, shape, or form. He's asked you to just simply be obedient. And you go, I don't know how, because we live in a culture that wants to see the whole plan, don't we? We live in a culture that wants the whole thing mapped out, and we want to understand it. And Abraham is just like us in that sense. There was always, how does this work? You say, well, how do you know that, Lee? I know that because he kept offering God alternatives. You know, God, here's my servant. You know, God, here's Ishmael. You know, so this must be how you're going to, because Abraham's trying to figure it out. And God says, Abraham, I'm not asking you to figure it out. Abraham knows not how God will work, but he does know that God will work. And so he just keeps following. He just keeps taking the next step and the next step and the next step and the next step. He just keeps obeying. He just keeps allowing God to paint the picture, to bring those squiggly lines and that muffled heartbeat into fuller and fuller manifestation. And Abraham will never see the fullest manifestation of it, but Abraham knows that God, listen to me again, is a covenant-keeping God, and he can be trusted. And so Abraham's obedience leads him to a satisfied life. Remember I told you that word means abounding or abundant, and it should ring a bell? Here's why it should ring a bell. If you fast forward to the New Testament and you look at the life of Jesus, in the life of Jesus, Jesus makes a statement to all of us. Here's his promise to us through his declaration to the disciples. He says this, he says, the thief's purpose is to steal, to kill, and to destroy. But my purpose is to give them, look at this, a rich, and see the word? Satisfying life. Thousands of years later, God's promise to Abraham to give him descendants and to make him a blessing is fulfilled in Jesus, who comes and establishes the new covenant. And now we are beneficiaries of that covenant. We are beneficiaries of Abraham's obedience and his faithfulness to follow God. Here's the principle I want to teach you this morning. It's so super simple. Obedience produces joy. It's so simple. In fact, it's so simple that when I landed on it and I wrote it, I thought, okay, what am I missing here? Where's the exception? Where's the qualification to this statement? I had a conversation with Brian about that. I said, hey, do you agree with this statement? I mean, it's so simple. And maybe simplistic is a better word because it's hard to do, right? But it's so true. Obedience produces joy. Abraham has a joy-filled life because he obeyed. See what the writer in Hebrews says? It was by faith that Abraham obeyed God when God called him to leave home and go to another land that God would give him and as his inheritance. He went without knowing where he was going. He went not seeing the whole picture, not understanding how that squiggly line promise would turn into the beautiful reality that is the new covenant in Jesus. But he followed, he obeyed. And even when he reached the land God promised him, he lived there by faith. His entire life was a live by faith life, for he was like a foreigner living in tents, and so did Isaac and Jacob, who inherited the same promise. So just real quick, as we come to kind of the end of this thought, we come to the end of the story, let me give you a handful of lessons from Abraham's life of joy. We think back over this whole 175-year journey. I know we talked about roughly 25 years of it. And I love this story. I think it might be the most compelling story to read in the book of Genesis. It's just a page turner. It's hard to stop reading the story. It's just so rich. But there's some lessons in this statement that Abraham lived a satisfying life, experienced a joy-filled life because of his obedience. And the first lesson is this: obedience is the full expression of trusting God. Obedience is the full expression of trusting God. Let me say it like this: you cannot obey unless you trust, and if you trust, you will obey. It works both ways. Obedience is built on trust. So I want to ask you this question: do you trust God? Do you trust God? For some of us, I can ask that question, and you're in an easy place. Yeah, oh yeah, I trust him. But some of you, some of us, we're in a challenging place. We're in a place where there are more questions than there are answers, where the lines are super squiggly and the heartbeat is super muffled. And that question of, do I trust God? Like, do I trust God with whatever the report is that comes back? Do I trust God with whatever the verdict is on my vocation? Do I trust God to take a leap of faith towards something that I don't know? Do I trust God? So I'm going to ask again, do you trust God? Obedience is the full expression of trusting God. Then here's the second lesson. Obedience means that we move forward as God leads and we allow God to care for the details. Move forward as God leads. What I love about this story is Abraham is not perfect. Do you realize that? Now, the Bible never, ever criticizes Abraham for his attempts to be obedient, because God doesn't demand perfection. God just demands faithfulness. And obedience is being faithful, following where God leads and allowing God to paint the details as he would paint the details. Third lesson, that when we follow in obedience, it allows us to experience the reality that with God, there is always more. You and I, at best, see the ultrasound. You and I, at best, see through a glass darkly, as Paul would write it. With God, there is always more. Can I give you a pro tip? Just a guy that's been following Jesus for a few years, and maybe for me, a little bit longer than some of you. God's more is always better than mine. It's always better than mine. God's more, when God promises Abraham blessing, Abraham had no idea what that blessing would look like. And I'll bet you, Abraham, like us, if God had come and said, now blessing is going to look like this, Abraham would have said, what? That's not blessing? Are you kidding? But once Abraham got there, it was so much better than he could ever imagine. And we are so limited by our here and now sight living. Because we go, I know the plan. I know what feels good, what is good. I know that. And God goes, you don't. You just don't. And if he told us in the outset what feels good and what would be good, we would disagree all the way through the process. And so God goes, just follow me. Trust me. I have good things for you, and they're better than your own plans. Obedience allows us to experience the more of God. And I'll just say this one last thing, and then we'll close. Obedience always, always, always has an impact, a life-giving impact on others. And I'm just going to leave that there. I'm just going to ask you this question as we close in prayer. It's a super simple question. Are you experiencing joy in your life? For Abraham, joy came in obedience. How about you? Lord, thank you for this story that is old, and it seems even potentially out of date, but yet, Father, is so compelling. Thank you for reminding us that you are a covenant-keeping God and that you, Father, do what you say and you keep your promises. Thank you, Father, for the way that you don't let us be limited by our sight and our perspective, but instead, Lord, you always offer us more. So, Father, today, would you help us to allow you to transform our life through the joy of Christmas that comes in the fulfillment of this Abrahamic covenant, the form of a baby that would bring a new covenant, a promise of blessing on all nations if we would accept. So, Father, this morning, if there's anyone within the hearing of my voice that doesn't yet know you, would they say yes to you? And Father, for everyone here that is asking the question, should I obey? Help them say a resounding yes and experience the abounding, abundant life you've promised. In Jesus' name I pray, amen.